Thank you everyone for joining this morning. We're delighted to see so many of you here, and thank you very much for investing your time to learn more about tapping into this underserved section of the workforce. I'm Stuart Lewis, I'm the CEO of Restless. We set up the business in 2019 with a mission of helping our members get the most from life. Today we've grown to over 1 million members in the UK, so that's 1 in 15 of all 50 to 70-year-olds, and we like to think of ourselves as a leading voice on the topic of an older workforce. I'm delighted to be joined today by 4 expert panelists from a range of different businesses and industries and organisations, and they're going to talk through the practical implications of leaning into multi-generational teams and embedding age inclusivity as a key part of their organisational strategy. Before we move into the panel session, which I know we're all very eager to get to, I'm going to start the session and talk briefly about why we believe age inclusivity is now essential for all businesses and it's no longer a nice to have. We think this will set the scene for an engaging panel discussion and hopefully lots of Q&A from the audience. If we have any questions as we go along, please do ask. If you can ask them directly to me in the chat, then I'll be able to store them up and ask our panel of experts when we get to the session. But yeah, the more questions we have, the better, and hopefully we can give you some really insightful thoughts and answers on your questions and concerns. Right, let's get started. So I'm a data-driven individual, as many of you will have seen from my LinkedIn post, and I always like to start with some really hard-hitting numbers just to set the scene on why we think this is so important. So first up is that 70% of the UK's employment growth has come from the over 50s over the last 30 years. So this is a long-term trend. It's not a short-term blip. It's not a short-term anomaly. It's quite a powerful statistic when you think about where all of the UK's employment growth has come from. Now, this has led to that today, almost 1/3 of the workforce is now over 50. And when I speak to HRDs, when I speak to chief people officers, one of the questions I always ask them is, are you spending roughly 1/3 of your time when it comes to recruitment, retention, training, employee benefits and so on actually this section of the workforce? And almost universally, it's an area that is, it's got so big in a very stealthy manner that people hasn't really been on the radar. And I think one of the reasons we're here today is to try and say why it should be on the radar and why it's so important with 1/3 of the workforce. This is no surprise, and these trends are no surprise when you look at long-term UK population forecasts. So we've had long-term trends of declining birth rates, we've had long-term trends of rising life expectancy. Obviously, this has taken a blip in the last couple of years with the pandemic, but the long-term trends are there and are there to stay. And that means that all population growth, literally all UK population growth over the next 20 years is coming from increased longevity and audiences over the age of 50. And with this seismic demographic change, this is why this should be top priority for all businesses and all workforces. One of my favorite charts I like to share is when you split out that rise in employment growth over the last 30 years by different age groups. So what you see is fewer young people entering the workforce because of declining fertility rates. Actually, there are fewer 16 to 24-year-olds in the workplace today than there were 30 years ago. And all of that, you see that huge rise in employment growth in the UK of many millions coming from workers over the age of 50. And you see the employment rate within that audience actually grow from 56% 30 years ago to actually 71%. So this is a huge seismic trend that has driven, almost been the engine room of growth of the UK economy. But what we've seen in recent months is that trend has changed. So actually, if you zoom in on that rise in growth in employment amongst the over 50 population over the last 10 years, you see that pretty much around the time when the pandemic hit, that long-term trend fundamentally changed. And what that means is that the labour market, you can draw an imaginary line up from where that trend line should be. We should have another 1 million people in the workforce based off long-term trends, and that would have made the whole current tightness of the labour market fundamentally different. But that is one of the primary drivers of actually why we are seeing such difficulties in recruiting and difficulties in retaining staff. Now, we've notionally put here the populist term of the Great Retirement, but the reality is actually retirement is only a fraction of the real reason and the underlying things that are going on. We'll come to talk about it in a second, but we know that a big driver of this economic inactivity has come from long-term sickness, has come from other challenges in the workforce, such as age discrimination. And we know that there's an enormous pot of over 600,000 economically inactive over 50s who want a job. And that gives us all as in the recruitment and the talent space an enormous opportunity, actually, if we can create an engaging workplace and employee offering for this demographic. Actually, there are a number of workers who are looking for employment behind the headlines. One of the big barriers we talk about is ageism. So we talk about it at Restless as being the last socially acceptable form of discrimination, and terms you wouldn't dream about hearing about someone based off their ethnicity or based off their gender are still routinely used when it comes to age. I've been talking at D&I conferences where I've had specific questions that people would never use. If you swap the term older worker for other forms of protected characteristic, would never have been said. So we know it's very, very real, and we know that many other organizations have done some similar surveys. Some of it is subtle, and some of it is people don't even realize they're doing it. So one of the things we're trying to do is to raise awareness of it and the challenges that it creates. So if we start around this kind of fulfilling cycle, you start in the top left. We know that many people face discrimination in the recruitment process. One of the most common forms of discrimination people come across is being told they're overqualified, and we'll dig into that in a bit more details in a second. We know that workers in their 50s typically receive less workplace training. So again, official government statistics on this show that workplace training levels decline as individuals get older. This means that once people are made redundant, they're more likely to be in long-term unemployment. And that reduces confidence and both physical and mental health, and creates a self-fulfilling cycle, if that makes sense. So we're really passionate about trying to encourage people to challenge outdated stereotypes on this, if that makes sense. So what are some of those stereotypes? And again, the reason I say it is because many of us don't even realize we use them or realize that they're there, if that makes sense. So we're just trying to highlight and make people aware of them. Some of the stereotypes we hear a lot are workers over 50 are not tech savvy. I mean, that may once have been the case 30 years ago. Today, we've got Bill Gates in his mid-60s. We've got Tim Cook, the leader of the biggest tech firm in the world at Apple, in his early 60s. This is the generation, it's the first generation of digitally native over 50s. And concepts such as tech savvy are almost used as a mislabel for trying to warn off older employees. So if you think about it, if you're hiring a software engineer, you'd never say they needed to be tech savvy. You'd say they need to have coding skills in C# or JavaScript, for example. Tech savvy is a funny label that we've created that almost has its own connotations around it. The next one is around older workers are expensive. Again, one of official ONS data show that actual average full-time earnings actually decline in our 50s and again in our 60s, implying that then on average, people are not more expensive, workers are not more expensive in their 50s and 60s. I wish I'd known this in my 20s because I'd have started saving a lot more into my pension back then. So it's quite a useful insight for us all to think about, actually. But we know that people are looking for lateral career paths and looking often for more rewarding, fulfilling work. And that can take its guise in many different areas, and it leaves a huge opportunity for us to offer very lateral career paths for people, actually, and benefit from their richness of life skills. Two of the others would be difficult to manage. They'll get bored quickly, and these often are the core underpinning of why someone is told they're overqualified. So we all know that some candidates are difficult to manage. We all know that some candidates will get bored quickly. Age shouldn't be a factor in that. But rather than picking that apart on a candidate level, often people do get lumped into that, especially if they're transitioning from a more senior role on paper or a more higher paid role into a potentially more junior role, which they may be very engaged in and very, very, very keen to pursue. One of the other pieces we see is role stereotypes. So I couldn't work with my mum or dad. I couldn't work with my mum and dad. No one could work with their mum and dad. That again is irrelevant of age, and whether people are in their 60s or their 20s, the parent-child relationship is quite an interesting concept and one that's probably best avoided in the workplace. But it is a reason we have it here is because I'm actually staggered how many times I've heard it firsthand from people saying suddenly making that link to their parents and thinking about a parental relationship actually rather than a workplace relationship, which are very, very different. I know my mum would be very different in the workplace than she is with me, and she'd be very much more professional. Next one is around trying new things. And again, this is just, it's a stereotype that hasn't caught up with reality. We see people really interested in trying new things, learning new things. And actually today there's a real thirst for knowledge and new experiences that we see come out with today's midlifers. So we think this turns on its head. One of the other interesting pieces we talk about is around how age can amplify other inequalities. So for example, gender. We know there is insufficient support in place to help women through the menopause journey. And often there's a lack of flexibility to help with caring responsibilities. We always point out how much effort and time is spent on focusing on parental leave. Rightly so, it's very important. But actually very little is spent on helping with policies and procedures for kind of elder care relief or looking after elder relatives, for example, or menopause support, as opposed to pregnancy support. Again, when we come back to think that 1/3 of the workforce is now over 50, we should probably be thinking about how we spend 1/3 of our time on our policies and employee benefits supporting this audience as well. And we know that gender pay gap gets wider with age, and that decades of a gender pay gap feeds an enormous private pension savings gap, actually. So these things, age can intersect with other inequalities in quite damaging ways as well. So what are the benefits? So moving into some of the positives, actually, and there's a number of enormous positives from engaging with this demographic. So the first is there's an incremental source of talent from an underrepresented audience. Now, this audience, we know that this audience statistically is more likely to stay in workplace and to have a higher retention rate than other cohorts of individuals. And this can be enormously powerful amidst the time of the Great Resignation. It can reduce training budgets, it can reduce onboarding and recruitment budgets. But we know there's a real attraction to the experience and that many of this cohort can bring to the workforce. We've got empirical research that shows that customer satisfaction can be higher where there's multi-generational teams. Now, again, the important thing here is not older is better or worse, actually just the benefit of having an age diverse workforce, which is something we really champion, actually has led to better customer outcomes. And we know that customers surveyed actually said that they like to see a mix of ages in the restaurant, or in this specific example. So the power of age diversity is really important from a customer perspective, which feeds into real pounds revenue. We also know that intergenerational teams are typically happier and they have great diversity of thought. Like if you think about trying to get natural two-way mentoring relationships, there's a real power, and there's quite we have it internally at Restless with our oldest individual in their late 60s and our youngest employee in their early 20s. And the harmony and inclusivity we get from such an age diverse team is actually really, really powerful. So we see it firsthand, but there's empirical research to show it's beneficial elsewhere. So with that backdrop, it gives us a perfect opportunity to introduce our panel for today. So what I'm going to ask is, if I go around the panel members as they're appearing on my screen, I will ask them to do a very quick intro to themselves and their organisation, and then we can jump into some of the questions. But Sarah, you're first up on my screen. Do you want to jump in and intro yourself?
My name is Sarah Dickinson. I head up everything recruitment at Fuller's. Fuller's is a managed tenancy pub and hotel business based in and around London and the South. And collectively, we operate around 400 pubs and hotels in those areas. I've been with Fuller's for 4 years, obviously 1 year in the normal world, and then 3 years kind of post-COVID. So it's been really interesting in the last few years, and I'm really kind of excited to share some of our experiences. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you, Sarah. Mark, you're next on my screen. Do you want to do a quick intro?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Hassan-Ali. I'm People Director at N Family Club, probably a brand name you aren't familiar with yet, but we are an early years nursery group that kicked off in 2017 with an original plan to open 10 amazing nurseries. Fast forward to the pandemic, actually, 2020, when I joined, we now have a mission to open 100 nurseries by 2026. Yeah, it's been a journey. So hopefully we can share some of that with you today.
Thank you, Mark. Kim, you're next.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chaplain, as it says on the screen. I work for the Centre for Ageing Better. I've worked for over 40 years in the area of employment and skills. I'm a special advisor now at Aging Better, which is a What Works organisation. And What Works organisations are evidence-based organisations that make recommendations to policymakers and others who are making decisions in the sort of strategic labour market in this case. We want a society, we're focused as an organisation on a society where everyone has a good later life, and our mission is to tackle ageism and take action to reduce inequalities. We have 3 action areas. We focus on ageism itself and tackling that, better homes and work. So I'm delighted to meet everybody and to be part of this conversation today.
Thank you, Kim. And Deborah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. I'm Deborah Mills. I am the CEO of Now Teach, and our speciality really is trying to encourage people who are career switchers into teaching, which, as we'll come on to say, is quite is at the moment is like a lot of employment sectors has got its challenges. I'm also a career switcher myself. So I think I have a kind of quite an interesting take on it, because I got into my 50s, having worked broadly in the same category for most of my career, and one way or another, with a little bit of kind of restructuring, etc., found myself in a position where I did need to make a career switch, and I made a career switch into teaching through Now Teach myself. So it's a bit of a kind of Victor Kiam story here. I was a teacher through Now Teach, and now I'm helping run Now Teach. So our speciality really is in insights about what makes people switch careers. We offer a sort of full kind of wraparound support for people when they're on this really difficult trajectory of changing something that they do, and often starting at the very beginning. So although teaching may seem like it's not particularly relevant to a lot of you, I think what I can help with are some of the insights about how to help people make that change. It sometimes feels like when we're talking to people about their moves that it takes 3 or 4 years for them to actually make the final move. And certainly it took me a little time. I didn't jump in off the deep end with any kind of gusto, because I think we all fear change. And I think change is very difficult, particularly if you've been in one kind of world for a long time. So I hope I'll be able to help with some of the questions around that, the sorts of people that we get, and the kind of support that we feel they need to come into a different career or come into a different kind of world.
Thank you, Deborah. I think your point there around how most people don't wake up suddenly and think I'm going to change today. There's often a long thought out process where there's lots of mini steps along the way into that transition. It made me reflect on my own experience of launching Restless, actually. So there was no magic moment where I wake up one day. It was lots of steps along the journey. And most of the people we talk to actually tell us something similar, that there are a number of different touch points as people consider their options and where they want to move forward. So it's really, really interesting. And great to have you all on the panel with us, and thank you very much for your time. Let me start with a question to our partners. So as we just talked about with some of our earlier slides, it's an incredibly unusual labour market right now, with many industries struggling to fill vacancies, and yet certain portions of the workforce, as we said, there's over 600,000 over 50s who are economically inactive and wanting to work. They're struggling to find work. What are your main hiring challenges right now? And perhaps, Sarah, I'll probably start with you if that's all right before going around.
Yeah, sure. I think if you were to ask that question to anyone who works in the hospitality industry, the first thing we're going to think about is chefs. I think that kind of mid-range, back of house level of chef is nowhere to be seen at the moment. That's how it feels anyway. We've got a real lack of kind of skill and trained chefs in the market, who are actually looking for jobs. And, we lost a massive proportion of our back of house teams, over COVID. Lots of chefs retrained in other sectors to do other things. Lots of chefs went home, wherever that may have been. And we have really struggled to get ourselves back in a comfortable position, I think, where we are able to deliver that food and that service to every single person that walks into our doors. I think another challenge we tend to have, being a business that's quite widespread over the south, is geography. You know, for instance, we operate Cotswolds Inns and Hotels, which is a collection of 6 hotels in the Cotswolds area. And again, you know, pre-COVID, a lot of our teams were made up from our EU workers who have evidently then gone home, and who can blame them, you know, after 3 times closing and reopening the doors, that, you know, lack of stability was really, really at the forefront of their mind. So I think, you know, naturally there's a lot less people in those areas as well, so a lot less people to target. So I'd probably say at the moment, obviously we have more than that, but if there was 2 I was to say, it would definitely be kind of geography, kind of outside of London, and also within our back of house positions as well.
Thank you, Sarah. That makes sense. And Mark, I'm going to keep going around in the similar order, but Mark, what would you say your key hiring challenges are right now?
Yeah, I think I echo Sarah, especially we have chefs in our nurseries as well, and that's proved a particular challenge. But I think for us on the whole, the big volume for us comes from educators. So qualified educators who are trained to teach at that, you know, at the level 3+ level. So we unfortunately, on the back of COVID, saw a lot of people move out of the early years sector. So they went into other sectors because they may have seen maybe seen it as easier, or just wanted to change, or whatever it might be. But the big thing with our sector is it's hard work, so you need passion. So if the passion goes, then so does the individual, unfortunately. But geography is a really interesting one that Sarah mentions as well. We operate, and we are building a nursery group which operates in some of the nicest parts of the country. But the reality of that is the people that are working in our nurseries can't afford to live in the areas that we operate in, so they are actually commuting in. And COVID, unfortunately, means that a lot of people don't want to commute. They don't want to get onto public transport. They don't want to travel far from home. So we're seeing a lot of people that want to stay closer to home, or be home-based, which just isn't possible. Home-based roles, unfortunately, teaching our children in our nurseries. So yeah, I would say it's that exodus of people that are thinking the grass is greener, and going to try something different. And the location element is definitely a challenge.
That makes sense, Mark. And again, that geography element, that mismatch between supply and demand for workers in certain areas is a key element of one of the challenges at the moment. We see it a lot with social care as well. So actually, where people are really struggling in later life social care, for example, with a mismatch of where people who need the care are, and people who are the workforce there to be able to support on that, if that makes sense. And Deborah, I know you've got a slightly unique setup in terms of the focus on teaching, and but I think no doubt you still have the same challenges everyone else has in terms of recruiting and attracting people to the program. What are some of your challenges?
Well, you know, I mean, I don't think it's any secret that teaching is in a particular crisis at the moment. We're in terms of both recruitment and retention, and in particular getting teachers for really important course subjects like the STEM subjects, like DT, like modern foreign languages, is becoming increasingly difficult. Now, the whole premise behind Now Teach is that we really believe that people who have had, you know, experience in other careers have got a lot of things to bring into the classroom. So in terms of, you know, the skills that they can bring, even if they're very specific professional skills, those are often very enriching, particularly in the subject, but also the life skills. I mean, most young teachers have been to school, university, and then back to school. So just having that breadth of experience is really valuable. And you find that even whether it's in the staff room, in the classroom, or with the senior leadership team, people are kind of interested in those sorts of experiences that you have to bring. But the cost of living crisis has really not helped. So it takes a long time, as I said, and as Stuart reinforced, to get someone to make that big decision. It's going to be usually a big drop in income to be a trainee teacher. And for a couple of years, the government disbanded the bursaries, which they give you for training. They don't really kind of, you know, they cover your university fee or your, you know, initial teacher training fee and a little bit extra, and they're calibrated according to the subject that you teach. But nonetheless, you know, you need to have some kind of savings or support from your family in some way to make that change. So what we saw last year was that people were deferring a lot. They were deciding, oh, well, maybe now isn't just the right time, particularly with the kind of drama in the economy that happened, in the summer. And it does take a little time for people to kind of get accustomed to these sorts of decisions. What we do find, though, is once they do it, it's incredibly rejuvenating and empowering for people. They're learning new stuff. They suddenly feel that they've got a pep in their step. But obviously, there are more practical issues sometimes too. And so, yes, it's hard out there at the moment, because there just aren't enough teachers, and the direction of travel in teaching is not inwards at the moment, it's outwards. And all of that bad publicity also doesn't help, because people fear what they're going to get into.
No, thank you, Deborah. And so all three of you are restless partners, so you kind of are deliberately looking to hire people in their 50s, 60s and beyond. Can you tell us why you've made that a part of your hiring strategy, and also what successes you've had from hiring age inclusively, if that makes sense? And again, Sarah, I'll probably head back to you to start us off.
No worries. I think if we kind of just go back to pre-pandemic, I think, Fuller's, we are a well-established, well-known brand. We've actually been around since 1845. So that's how, well-known we would be in particular parts of the country. And I think we were always confident that we were attracting a wide range of people to come and work for us. Post-pandemic, we saw a massive increase in the amount of 16 and 17-year-olds that were applying and going on to work with us, to the point where we now have more of these younger workers than we've ever had. So then it kind of makes you think, okay, well, how are we then targeting, if we're going to have lots and lots of younger workers, how do we get that balance in our workforce? So we really started to think about the older workers, and kind of how we might be able to do something to target this particular community. We knew we already had people in this community in our business already, but obviously we just wanted to do more of that. So it was actually one of my colleagues who'd mentioned Restless to me. Her father-in-law is a member. So I kind of went on, filled in a form, and then by the next day I was on a call with Ian, kind of speaking about how we can move this partnership forward. And as mentioned earlier, we've been around for a long time, so our customers are also made up of, multiple generations as well. And we believe it's so important that we, represent our customers through the people that work in our pubs and hotels. We also believe that the older generation are often best placed to motivate, support, and really inspire our younger teams as well. And I think in terms of successes, so we've currently got around 600 of our employees who are 50 plus, so that's about 10% of our workforce at the moment. They obviously, you mentioned in the intro, they bring an exceptional level of customer service and customer interaction. They represent our customers, the best placed, as mentioned, to support our, our younger workers. But then selfishly, it's also giving us a really fabulous opportunity to shout about some of these great people who already work in our business and share their stories and their transition from, okay, I was an accountant and now I would like to be a chef. It's been really lovely to be able to share those stories as well, not only to, promote ourselves within that community and be, a much more kind of well-known age diverse employer, but equally to attract, more people like the current people we have into the business as well. So we're definitely at the kind of start. We're just past the start line, I would say. We're definitely not all the way there, but I think some of the things we've already, started to kind of think about and work on, which obviously we'll go on to in a little bit, have been actually really inspiring. So it's been great.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think that the piece, so much there resonates with us, but the piece around reflecting the local community in the workforce is so powerful, and we know that's really important in hospitality. We know it's also important in retail and other customer service and frontline service functions as well. So absolutely makes perfect sense. Mark, from your perspective, can you tell us why you've made it a part of your strategy, and again, any successes you've had from hiring age inclusivity?
Yeah, absolutely. I think diversity full stop for us is what enriches what we do. We're educating the next generation essentially. So for us, it's at the core and center of everything we do, whether it's our people strategy or our business strategy. So for us, we've got dwindling numbers of people that are taking the early years qualifications, unfortunately. So we can see in the stats that there's a reduction, unfortunately, a bit like Deborah's mentioned, in people going into those professions. So for us, it was a bit of an awakening to kind of say, how are we going to either grow our own or reach the market of people who are out there? For us, Restless was gold, because it kind of opened our minds and kind of just got us thinking so much. And we kicked off back end of last year with really trying to engage with that group in particular, and it's worked massively for us. And I think the richness that it brings to the existing team and the balance it brings within an environment that now well-being and mental health is such a challenge across teams, to bring in a real balance of age into the mix there. We've actually seen some great budding relationships between older workers and younger workers. We've seen some supportive relationships in terms of younger workers going through their qualifications because the older worker has been through it. So it's almost enriched relationships within teams, as well as being able to we've been able to support and offer what we do as a business. I think the success for us is in being able to grow at the scale that we are, with a really age diverse mix of people. So yeah, I mean, for us, it's just a core part of our strategy now, and that we're going to continually invest in, because of the value and the richness and the life experience that those roles bring, because the passion you have to have to work with children. I think if you've been a grandparent, a parent, or a carer, there has to be a degree of passion in that. So to translate that into the workplace, it is gold for us.
That makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. And as you say, with 1/3 of the workforce and that number only being over 50, and that percentage only increasing, it has to be a core part of workforce planning for any organisation from our perspective. And Deborah, so your organisation's kind of raison d'etre is around leveraging experience and so on.
Absolutely. And our kind of oldest recruit, I think, was 67. I mean, I think we're one of the first Restless partners, I believe. Actually, Stuart, you'll be able to correct me if we're not right. And actually, from a personal perspective, I noticed Restless quite early on and joined it. I think it's a great idea I always talk about unleashing the potential of those 50-somethings into the workforce. And sometimes actually it does need a bit of a career switch to unleash those, because, you know, there is, I mean, one of the statistics that's around at the moment is that 50-something teachers, you know, have been part of that great retirement. I mean, in some cases, if they're career teachers, that's not really very surprising. They have quite good pension deals. But I think, and people are very surprised by that, but I think it's very difficult to maintain your level of learning and stimulation in a career over a whole lifetime like that. And I think, you know, one of our kind of founding texts that Katie and Lucy, our founders, were very influenced by was the 100-Year Life, which is about kind of how do we survive and keep ourselves productive, healthy, mentally stimulated in a world where we're all going to live a lot longer. And one of those things is by changing tack and being agile in terms of our approach to working. And maybe we won't do the same, you know, we obviously won't do the same thing, and maybe it won't be as well paid, and maybe it will be a bit more community focused. And certainly one of the big motivations we find in people who come into teaching is they just want to give something back. They've very often been in commercial situations. So for example, we have a Google engineer, an ex-Google engineer, very senior guy, who is now a maths teacher, but he runs these AI classes as an enrichment in his schools, and they're incredibly popular. He's had to put on even more because they're so popular. And that's a really sort of perfect example, and I've got so many of them really, of someone who has come out of the commercial world, wants to give something back, but then is also able to tap into those skills that they've learned over the years and that level of expertise to bring something to a school and to children that no one else could probably bring them. There's probably nobody else in a school who could deliver an AI class like Deepak, because he knows everything there is to know about it. So I think things like that, that's just one example, but I think things like that are why we really believe in the potential of them. And as I said, you know, whether you don't have to have been a high flyer at Google to be able to have those things which nobody else can deliver to children, and which really enrich not just their experience, but also their outcomes. I also think, actually, on one level, just being able to have people in teaching who have had other careers is important. There's a saying that keeps being repeated a lot at the moment, which is you can only be what you can see. And I think the fact is, for a lot of children, particularly in deprived areas, they don't really see much in the way of what other careers are. They think only in terms of the things that they see on TV. And so for the number of young boys that you come across who just want to be a footballer, you know, you sort of think, right, okay, well, that is a real case of you want to be what you can see. And I think one of the great things about 50-something people in the workplace, and particularly in teaching, is that they can open windows into other worlds of work and talk about those kind of career options as well, which I think can be inspiring and can create a kind of aspiration which otherwise would be not there. They always say, by the way, why on earth did you move into teaching? Because the people who have the lowest opinion of teachers are, of course, their pupils, but they also love them dearly too. So it's a very strange relationship.
Thank you, Deborah. And that your comment about the 100-year life. So for anyone on the call, that was one of the driving influences for Restless as well. It's a book by Linda Grattan and Andrew Scott that I'd highly recommend in terms of opening your eyes to the new world of longevity. But yeah, a really influential book. Kim, I might bring you in at this point, if that's okay. Can you talk to us through some of the benefits of a multi-generational workforce?
Yeah, delighted. I think it's a really nice hook, actually, talking about the 100-year life. Just to reflect on that, we are still looking at a labour market and a design of work that was established in the mid-20th century, when we all were very lucky to live to be 70. And so I do think we're going through remarkable times in terms of work, and COVID has pushed that or stretched the envelope even further. We do need to look at longer working lives for various reasons, but that stretch of work doesn't necessarily have to be designed and packaged as the first stage of working life. Now I'm going to talk in two areas, really. There's very, very clear evidence on the benefits of multi-generational workforces. There's a really good report that was published in December 2019 by OECD that directly links multi-generational teams to productivity, and clearly illustrates that a multi-generational team is more productive. And when you dig into that report, it's a bit of a heavy read, but I love it. Where the productivity is actually around how much more productive younger people can be when they're working in a team alongside elder workers. So you don't necessarily see an increase in productivity in the elder worker, which is why probably they're not as valued as they should be, but their influence on the younger worker is absolutely remarkable. So that's empirical, that's where it is. There's no doubt about it that if you tend to the balance of your workforce and make sure it's multi-generational, you will get more productivity. And given the demographics, I think that steers you towards having to tend a lot more than you used to the older dynamic, and to making sure that you keep that balance, because individuals themselves are not detached from the labour market. It's not working for them. So you need to be more proactive to keep that balance of multi-generation. What I would also say observationally, moving from evidence to observation, is there is very clear evidence that anything you do around the design of work, that there are 5 sort of pillars of things you can do to make work more attractive to older workers. And when you work in those pillars, Nothing that you do that will attract older workers disadvantages any other groups. That's very clear in terms of empirical evidence as well. And just picking on something that you said earlier on, Stuart, about inequalities, actually, and the fact that older workers represent all of the other protected groups. The observation is actually that generally when people look at D&I and inclusion, they tend to segment the protected characteristics, and they will say to you, oh, I'm doing race or I'm doing gender, because that's the most important. And often disability and age are the poor relations. People don't start there. My observation is, though, if you start with age, if you tackle age, you shouldn't start at any point of protected characteristics. Don't leave out age. And if you tackle age and make age a priority, what you generally see is an uplift to all of the people in your organisation, because nobody is disadvantaged. A good example, for example, would be flexibility. You start looking at flexibility, which is a clear attraction for older workers. That is the number one thing that people that are disengaged from the labour market say would attract them and bring them back, flexibility. It actually benefits everybody in your workforce. So that balance and that approach of your aim and your strategy is around having balance in age and having a multi-generational workforce is clearly as evidence-based, productively sound, but also observationally based, a really good way of dealing with inequalities in D&I.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Kim. And then, so we're big believers in flexible working and the ability that it has to actually create win-win scenarios for both employees, but also the workforce. We also recognise that for many employees, there's a lot of practical constraints to role design and so on and so forth. If I ask our partners just to talk through kind of how do you think about flexibility, and have you made any changes to policies or processes to try and make roles appeal more to this demographic? Again, I might go back to you, Sarah, just to keep the sequencing going.
No problem. So I think we're quite fortunate in that we're not your kind of typical Monday to Friday 9 to 5 business. You know, our pubs may operate anything from breakfast through to bedtime, and our hotels never close their doors. So actually, when it comes to people wanting flexibility to just do mornings because they need to do a school pickup, or weekends because they generally have plans or do another job during the week, then we truly believe that we have something for everyone. And we are a real promoter really of everyday flexibility. That's what's important to us, you know, that ability to say, oh, I've got a doctor's appointment on Thursday. Am I able to swap to the evening shift? You know, the ability to contact your existing colleagues, ask for a shift swap. You know, we try to do our rotas 2 weeks in advance. That's quite important for us, you know, because we will never fully be work-life balance friendly as a hospitality business. So we try to give as much notice as possible for shifts. We give the ability to swap, to pick up additional shifts if you have more time. So that everyday flexibility piece is really, really important for us. And, you know, kind of pre-pandemic, our total employee headcount was around kind of 5,500. Post-pandemic, we're now at about 6,500, and that is growing. And actually, the reality is, we haven't necessarily opened lots of new businesses and created lots of new jobs. What's happening now is that actually we are finding that a lot of people are coming to us, and actually, you know, we've had to get used now to coming away from the, would you like full-time or part-time? You know, that doesn't really mean anything anymore, I believe. And actually the question is more now, how many hours would you like to work? And when would you like to work these hours? So really, you know, and from our general manager's perspective, that's clearly been a bit of a challenge because they're quite used to working on a kind of full-time, part-time basis. But actually now when a GM comes to me and says, oh, we really need help finding a full-time receptionist, let's say, you know, we're always trying to encourage that, okay, well, actually 2 people could do that job. You know, it's not just one person who has to work 5 days a week, 40 hours. That could be 2 people doing 20 hours and kind of complementing each other on the shift. So I think, you know, we have that flexibility, but obviously those behavioural changes, particularly when you're a business that has 200 hiring managers that you need to influence and empower to deliver this great people experience that we're kind of really pumping from the heart of the business. You know, they've really got to get on board with it as well. It's all well and good me sat here saying, oh, Fuller's is great and we do this and we do that. The reality is it's our general managers who deliver this experience day in, day out. So, you know, for them, it's about giving them the why, what's in it for them, because clearly that will spur them on a little bit to do a bit more. But ultimately, you know, we're responsible for giving them the tools and the training and really encouraging those kind of behaviours around kind of age diverse, recruitment as well. But yeah, so yes, we do offer flexibility, and we try to, you know, do it in lots of different ways because everyone has different needs when it comes to flexibility.
Thank you, Sarah. The part-time one is, again, close to our heart. We know that the same job advertised as part-time will get a higher response rate than the same job advertised as full-time. So we know that that kind of flexibility is really helpful in today's tight labour market because people are searching for it. Yeah. Another stat I always like to throw out is 40% of all part-time workers are over the age of 50. So again, most people are surprised by that because they always typically think of a student audience when you're thinking about a part-time workforce. Actually, this flexibility is really key. 1 in 2 self-employed workers is over the age of 50. Again, partly because people are looking for flexibility around that. So it is a powerful way of attracting and retaining people, actually. And Mark, kind of, if you to shed some light on your organisation, for example, like how are you changing things? Are you changing things for this demographic?
Yeah, definitely. I echo everything Sarah said there. I love the idea of everyday flexibility. Yeah, for us, it's a mindset, and it's a mindset shift, and that's the big thing you've got to get over, and you've got to try and get a good conversation around, because I think lots of hiring managers, their initial thoughts are, well, that job can't be part-time, or that job can't be fluid in its hours or whatever. The reality is you probably could make it work in most cases. And we went through that journey of thinking everybody, you need to be 40 hours a week over 5 days, and this is what happens, and that real kind of structured approach. The reality is we now have an absolute tapestry of flexible working, and we've got, there's different versions of full-time, there's different versions of part-time, and then we've also got casual as well. And it's trying to create something that makes somebody feel like that works for me, but also I'm getting the value that I need by doing what I do. The big challenge we came up against was people feeling like if they were not on a full-time contract, what impact would that have to their development? So they still want to develop, they still want to learn, they still want to grow within the organisation. But actually, if I work 20 hours and the person sitting next to me works 40 hours, is there a difference in my development? And the reality is no. It should be about delivery and execution, and actually the input and what you bring to the organisation in terms of contribution, as opposed to presenteeism and kind of how many hours you do. So that was one of the big things that opened our eyes when we looked at flexibility, and almost taking it to an extent to kind of look at fluidity with work as well, and the variation of maybe not always working in the same place. Maybe not always working in the same room within the nursery, and the different facets that come with it. Also, a big thing we decided to do was we offer flexible working requests from day one, as opposed to waiting for the kind of government legislation guidelines. The reason we did that was because, and actually it worked really well for the older market as well. Your initial thoughts are, yeah, I can do those hours, that's going to work for me, it's going to work perfectly. The reality is life changes, mindset changes. Once you join the organisation, you don't want to be at detriment for having to kind of I don't know, either leave the organisation or whatever. So for us, there's value in letting people put in those requests earlier, because it means you retain them, and actually they're happier because they're doing the hours that they can do. Because the realisation is, yes, jobs are important, but that's not the only single biggest thing in that person's life. So we need to go to where they are as well.
That makes sense. I think it's really interesting around, again, just picking up what you were saying about progression, and like around career progression should be around the level of what level someone is operating around, not the hours they're doing. But it's definitely a concern people have, and it's fantastic you guys are addressing that and thinking about how you can enable that for people. And again, Deborah, I know your whole organisation is geared up to this. Like, if I tweak the question slightly and say, like, what do you think are some of the most important considerations for someone who is considering a big career change in their 50s to try and attract them?
Well, I mean, in terms of our own organisation, we are very flexible indeed. We don't even have an office anymore. We are completely virtual, and people work all sorts of different ways. I don't think that's untypical in the charity sector generally. And of course, what we've witnessed since COVID is the most astonishing acceleration in a way of working that would have been unthought of. I mean, I come from a background in advertising and marketing where you had to leave your coat on the back of your chair if you went home before 7 o'clock, just to, you know, because people were very concerned about people working the full hours, and the amount of time you were in the office was a real measure of your commitment, which of course now is completely changed and very, you know, and that's a very good thing as far as I can see. Teaching has been very slow where flexible working is concerned, but it's really started to get with the programme. And certainly, when I first went into teaching, particularly coming from the creative industries, I was appalled that, you know, I had to be on site so much and that there was so little flexibility, and that even, to be honest, going for a pee required a bit of scheduling that I wasn't really quite prepared for. So it has gone from that to a much more kind of concerned approach. I've just spent the first part of this week up north talking to leaders of big teaching academies about what their requirements are, how we can kind of problem solve for some of the recruitment issues. And flexible working was on everybody's list. What's more important and more significant, it is also on the DFE list, and we are taking part and working with them in a flexible working party. We recognised, though, quite early on, that particularly if you've got people in their 50s who may have taken early retirement, the last thing they really want to do is commit to the sort of slightly brutal regime of teacher training, where you're in all the time, you're probably in front of children all the time, you're feeling a bit unprepared. And we developed a very condensed form of teacher training with ARC academies, which has actually become something of a template for the rest of the sector. And we are working as well with the National Institute for Teaching just to make the idea of being able to train flexibly also an attractive thing, so that you don't have to kind of change your life entirely to open up this opportunity to do this rather worthwhile thing down the line. And as I said, I think as the DFE have got behind this, as schools are recognising that they need to be more flexible, I think we're going to see many more creative solutions, which will be much more appealing to 50-somethings who don't necessarily want to work a 60-hour week and are rather intimidated by that, but still do want to do that bit of good in the world, help young people, benefit outcomes, and do all of those other great things that teaching unlocks.
That's really interesting, Deborah. And again, just to pull out on something that really resonated with me there is the part-time flexible training as distinct from flexible working, because often people know they want to get to a new pathway. Many of them can't afford to go back to university and just quit their jobs. So the ability to train alongside working on a part-time basis, actually, even if they can work full-time when they're through the training, that part-time training and part-time entry pathways is quite powerful to help people manage those transitions, actually, because not everyone can afford to kind of almost give up and go straight into training and lose the income entirely, if that makes sense. I'm conscious of time, but Kim, I'd love you to just talk a little bit around the Centre for Ageing Better's work around the Age-Friendly Employer Pledge, because I think it's really important for people to be aware of it, and I think it's a fantastic initiative.
Thank you, Stuart. What I'm conscious of in this conversation is that I'm probably talking to the converted. I think we're all on this call because we're interested in this agenda and we're committed to make it change. We did a survey in the middle of COVID to check out where employers' attitudes were when it came to age. And what was really interesting was that there is a really big level of awareness of how the labour market has changed and a level of awareness of ageism. But most organisations believe, whilst they believe that ageism exists in their sector, it doesn't necessarily happen in their organisation. And when we tested organisations, what we found was that only 1 in 5 had a structured plan in mind to do anything about the things that they saw. And actually, the general theme at that point, and I'm seeing some change with this, was that the labour market as we see it now is in a temporary position. So we are looking at the labour market with all these tight labour markets, and so we're having to be concerned about older workers because there's nobody else. But somehow that's going to reverse and we can go back to how we were. That's just not true. Stuart's already put the slides up that demonstrate that we were on a journey before COVID. We are ageing as a population, and the labour market as you see it and the workforce as you see it is your workforce. And if you are going to be productive in the economy moving forward, you need to think about this fundamental change in the profile of age in your workforce. So at the back end of last year, we launched an age-friendly pledge. And the purpose of the pledge is twofold. If you're associated with Restless, you will be doing a lot of the good stuff. But what we want to see is organisations coming together and saying very publicly that we need to see this movement of change. And what we also see is that organisations are looking at the policies, but just as we've talked today, there's a lot to be gained from working together to understand how an organisation that's similar to you has solved the problem that you are facing in terms of retention and recruitment, in particular retention. For example, how do other organisations manage phased retirements, hanging on to people, but not necessarily in the same way with work packaged in the same way as they have done through a 40-year career. And so we, as I say, launched an age-friendly pledge. The pledge requires people to publicly say, organisations to publicly say they will take one action against a framework of 5 pillars in a 12-month period. And it provides support in those actions as well. And it provides opportunities for organisations to talk to each other about those action areas. So I guess in terms of the people that are on this call, what we're really interested in is organisations acting as leaders for others that aren't taking action, but also in that process, learning some more about this agenda as it changes, because we are in the middle of this significant change. So I would be delighted if people would come along and sign up to the pledge, because the more organisations that we have signed up to the pledge, the more we create this movement of, you know, this is a reality of the labour market as we see it. And I think we can circulate a link to our website later after this call. But, you know, we need, I think we have a responsibility to resolve our own circumstances in our workforce, but also actually to be part of something bigger that tackles the ageism and tackles other things that happen in the labour market. Because fundamentally, we want to see older workers moving around in this labour market. So somebody who's your employee at one point could be somebody else's employee later on. And that's important as well. And we do see this age group at the minute being very more static and risk averse in the labour market than younger people. And one of the positive outcomes we want to see is actually people over 50 moving with confidence in the labour market and travelling to other and contributing to other employers. And that needs to be you know, part of a collective responsibility to improve the labour market and make it work better for everyone that's over 50, because we're all going to, well, I am there, but we're all going to be there at some point. So we have a personal vested interest as well as a corporate interest, I think.
Thank you so much, Kim. That's it, folks. We're out of time. I'd like to say huge thanks to our panelists for coming on and sharing their wisdom today. Huge thanks to everyone for joining. We will be circulating a recording of this afterwards. We've had a couple of very insightful questions come through as well, so we'll be answering those afterwards and circulating responses, along with links to the age-friendly employer pledge and also the 100-year life book, because I think it's very powerful. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely day.